Hello, darling viewers. It's Jen here at Check Her Joy, and this time I'm reviewing Trigger Warning by Neil Gaiman. I listened to part of this in the audiobook, which is narrated by Neil Gaiman, and read part of it in the actual book. It is a collection of short stories and poems. There are 25 of them total. They range from being a couple pages long to, I think the longest one's a little under 30 pages. And I'm not going to go through all 25 in this review, I'm sorry. The short stories are mostly fantasy, sometimes a little bit sci-fi. They're magical and creative, and sometimes they're light, sometimes they get a bit dark, sometimes they get a bit creepy. Some of them are really funny, some of them can be a combination of all of them together, but like most of Neil Gaiman's works, they have twists on things that are kind of familiar or twist endings that you sort of aren't sure what exactly is going to happen with it. So, tons of surprises. On the whole, I really enjoyed this collection. Obviously, some of them I'm going to enjoy more than others, and my favorites may not be your favorites out of here because it does kind of just take everything that Neil Gaiman's written and just a little bit of all of that. So, some of them are creepy ghost stories, and some of them are light fantasy. Some of them are fairy tale retellings, some of them are poems, and some of it is like experiences like normal day stuff. Like the very first one is called Making a Chair, and it basically is him assembling this office chair in an attempt to procrastinate writing, and it feels so real as somebody who tries to write and is also a huge procrastinator to be like, yeah, anything to get me out of doing this. Also, he compares the chair to assembling the chair to being similar to putting a story together with all the different parts and the steps you have to go through. So actually Making a Chair is one of my favorites. So one of the big stories that is in here is The Case of Death and Honey, which is a Sherlock Holmes story. Part of it is Sherlock Holmes, and he's mostly telling the story of Mycroft, his brother's death, and what he was going through, and the conversation that he and Mycroft last had, and how the two of them see the world and their places in it. And then there's also this narrative that it jumps back and forth between, which is the missing beekeeper, who is this guy in the mountains who has a strange visitor, and then they both go missing and trying to figure out what happened. It's not a case that Sherlock Holmes seems to be investigating himself, so it feels a bit discordant to have these two together, but it does seem like it could have happened around, the late 19th century when Sherlock Holmes was happening. The parts about Sherlock Holmes really do feel like it's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, to the point that I'm like, did Neil Gaiman just take these straight out of a Doyle book? Like, I'm a little confused. Like, it's that good. And I really did like the beekeeper story, but the two of them together, especially when it bounces back and forth, was a little bit weird. There's also the short story Black Dog, which follows Shadow from American Gods as he's traveling in England, and he comes across the small town that is being and he comes across this small town where strange things is happening, and there seems to be this grim-like dog, this big black dog, that when you see it, it signifies death coming. And Shadow, being the one who has already experienced all these weird, creepy gods and supernatural things happening, how he kind of takes it and is like, okay, this could just be a tale, or there could actually be something really weird happening. And it's also great to just have more Shadow. So I loved that story. It's a little bit creepy, but also kind of fun. This one also has The Sleeper and the Spindle, which is a fairy tale. It's Neil Gaiman's version of Sleeping Beauty and Snow White kind of messed together. We have this queen who appears to be kind of Snow White from that story, and she's going into this neighboring country to lift this magic spell that has befallen their neighbors, where the whole town has fallen under this sleeping spell, and she has to wake the princess. And just, it's an adventure story of trying to save it. There's not really romance in it. It's about a female heroine trying to save another one, and I love that. I love that story. It was fun. I was just disappointed when it ended. I was like, I need more. No, why did it just end? The short story, Nothing O'Clock, is in here. It is a Doctor Who story following Amy and the 11th Doctor. And Nothing O'Clock does appear in the Doctor Who short story collection, 11 Stories, 11 Doctors from the 50th anniversary. But it's reprinted in here, and also on the audiobook, you get to listen to Neil Gaiman read it, so that was pretty awesome. This one follows Amy and the Doctor as they return to Earth, and they encounter an alien species that appears to be trying to buy up Earth, like one parcel of land at a time so that they can legally own Earth, which is an interesting concept. Like, can you argue with them if they bought these humans, sold these aliens their land? Can you really argue with the aliens then for taking over all of London by slowly buying it up? And then their grand scheme is to slowly buy up the rest of Earth. So this one is super interesting. It's also very early on in Amy's time with the Doctor, and there's a lot of Amy missing Rory and being concerned mostly about Rory first. All of humanity's in trouble, but Amy just wants to know, is Rory okay? Where is Rory? Can we find him? This is who I care about. And the Doctor's kind of trying to be like, hey, everybody else is in danger too. So it's kind of adorable to see Amy. It doesn't feel too unlike Amy. Like, sometimes she's tough and maybe doesn't always seem like she loves Rory that much, but it's not overdone in this too. There's a calendar of tales where there are 12 really short stories, and each one relates to a month of the year. So there's a January story, a February story, a March story, an April story, so on. They kind of fit into what we think about these months, and some of them are something obvious. Like, the January story is about the old year training the new year on how to do the job, and apparently they're fighting off some kind of demon thing that wants to take over time, which was really interesting. And some of them are a little more obscure. Like, one of the spring ones was about these ducks that are gambling with this old man, how he's losing and losing and losing, and how you shouldn't bet against a duck or something. So a calendar of tales specifically had this collection of, it just could be anything, whatever, which I kind of loved and enjoyed. There was also Click Clack the Rattlebag in here, which is kind of this creepy ghost story. This guy shows up in a haunted house that his girlfriend just moved into, and the girl's little brother wants to be put to bed, and he's like, aren't you scared? And the kid's like, well, maybe you could just tell me a story. And when he doesn't have a story, the kid's like, well, let me tell you a story. And it's a super creepy story about these creatures called the Click Clack the Rattlebags. And even though I already knew the story and knew how it was going to end, it was still creepy. It's just tone-wise a very creepy story. There's also one in here called the Lunar Labyrinth, where this guy is on this road trip and he stops at this one roadside attraction where there is this labyrinth that people walk in at night. It's like a hedge maze. And he goes to this town and they're like, oh, well, we burnt it down, but you can come see the spot. And that one's interesting about that one I found interesting also. With the traveling and all these different roadside attractions that he's seen and how, like, the story of these places. And, it's a little bit weird also because it's Neil Gaiman, without spoiling what happens in that story. Yeah, so those were my favorites, and the ones that stood out to me the most. Not that there aren't also other amazing stories in here that are totally worth checking out. The introduction, though, is a bit weird, and I honestly just skipped it. He starts going through how he thought of each of these stories, and I'm like, I haven't read these stories yet, so I'm just gonna skip you. Also, the title of Trigger Warning seems a bit weird, and it's one of the reasons why I didn't read this before then. It's like, so do each of these stories need a trigger warning? And probably not more than any other Neil Gaiman stories. I mean, there's death and crazy, creepy violence and stuff happening in them, but nothing more than usual. I didn't write down how many stars I gave this, and honestly, I can't remember. It was either a 3 or 4, somewhere in there. Obviously, some of these stories are way better than others. Some of these stories I would have given like a 5 stars if it's just reviewing that. And some of them I'm like, these are more like 2s. It's not my thing and not digging it. So a mixed bag, as most short story collections are. I do love the audiobooks where Neil Gaiman is reading his own works. Like, they are amazing, and I love his interpretations of everything. So I definitely suggest checking that out if you haven't already listened to Neil Gaiman reading any of his stuff. On the whole, it's pretty good. I mean, it's not... His short story collections are never, like, my favorite, but they're still also entertaining and interesting. Let me know in the comments below if you've read Trigger Warning or any of the short stories in it. and what you thought of them. What are your favorite Neil Gaiman books and stories? And do you have any other recommendations for reading? So, peace out. I love you guys and keep reading.